Yeah, so this is actually an area where our lab has done a pretty significant amount of research. That we tend to think of hurricanes as these acute hazards that bring wind, heavy rainfall, storm surge. And while all that's true, even when those hazards dissipate, the hurricane can still provide impacts that a community feels for some weeks afterwards. That's primarily due in the form of power outages, right? So, even though the storm has gone away, those power outages might persist for several weeks. And also, as we in Louisiana know, peak hurricane season, August, September, October, those are really warm times of the year. So when you're dealing with potentially spells of heat in the mid to upper 90s, but without air conditioning, that can be something that actually leads to mortality on its own. Actually, about a third of the deaths from both of Hurricane Ida and Hurricane Laura were actually due to heat exposure, not the storm itself.
Gotcha. And so when you look at power lines, you talk about maybe trees in that sense. How do Louisiana's trees play a role in the aftermath of that? Because right now what we're dealing with is the drought from last year that are killing a lot of these different trees, and we're not really seeing the, I guess, remembrance of that. If you can kind of talk about how Louisiana's trees play a role in the aftermath of a storm.
Mhm. Yeah, so obviously Louisiana has a lot of trees. The more trees you have, the easier it is to bring power lines down. So we've probably all seen a utility truck out there doing some tree trimming, trying to get some of those big problematic limbs that might crash down onto some power lines out of the way proactively. But obviously that's still a significant hazard. If the whole tree comes down, then that's going to take a power line with it. As you mentioned, we had the drought last summer, which really weakened trees throughout the state. And so there's even on LSU's campus, sort of proactive tree trimming about removing some dead oak trees that perished during last summer's drought. So there's probably some weakened trees still lingering around throughout the state, and a storm like this provides a real test to sort of the structural integrity of those trees, if you will, and hopefully the power grid is able to handle it.
And so when you look at some of those hazards that you will be able to see, right? We talked about down power lines, down trees. What are some other different hazards that people can look for, let's say like airborne debris, for example?
Mhm. Yeah, so this kind of goes back to more that acute hazard of a hurricane, right? So this is where unsecured lawn furniture, trash cans, those types of things that are sort of maybe a typical fixture of a front patio. If those become airborne during a storm, that's really one of the main reasons that you'll see people, particularly along the coast, placing plywood over their windows, right? It's concern for flying debris that's lofted by the strong winds. So that's always something. That's why we, recommend that people stay inside during the storm, even though it's tempting during the eye of the hurricane to sort of step out and get a breath of fresh air. Once those winds pick back up, that can loft more debris and pose an airborne hazard.
So when you look at Tropical Storm Francine right now, obviously it's not as strong as a hurricane Category 3, Category 4, and things of that nature. But if you can compare and contrast this one to other storms that we've seen, right? We could talk about Beryl, or we could talk about Laura or Ida, that's brought up some pretty bad damage around South and other parts of Louisiana. But kind of compare and contrast between what you see right now with Francine and kind of the impacts for that.
hmm Yeah, so Francine looks like it's going to be a weaker storm than maybe some of those that we've experienced recently, right? Hurricane Laura was a Category 4, very damaging. Same with Hurricane Ida. We're not thinking that Francine will be quite as strong, but it bears some of the typical signatures of a Gulf of Mexico storm, primarily in that it sort of, for lack of a better term, springs up out of nowhere. And of course, to meteorologists that are monitoring these situations, we are aware of these disturbances before they sort of reach the public eye. But this is a very typical storm in the sense that we might only have about 72 hours or so from the time that really this is starting to become a real focal point of media coverage to the time that it makes landfall. And so that requires rapid preparation. Any gasoline that needs to be collected, getting cash, getting prescriptions ready. We're on sort of a condensed timeline for that. And that's pretty typical of a Gulf of Mexico storm. I would say, though, in contrast to maybe a storm like Laura that formed in the Atlantic and then came all the way across Cuba into the Gulf of Mexico, where maybe we were monitoring that one for well before a week before it made landfall. So a bit of a quicker turnaround here with Francine.
Gotcha. So any final thoughts that you want to add?
No, I just ask that people pay attention to the latest forecast, stay on top of guidance from the local media outlets as well as the National Weather Service, and stay safe and be prepared.
All right, well, LSU Assistant Professor Paul Miller, thank you for joining me today.
Yep, absolutely. Anytime.